Well, first you have to define what is a stop and frisk. A stop and frisk encounter basically is where I'll give you the case, the example of the case. The case is Terry versus Ohio. What happened is there's a guy wearing a big long coat. It was warm outside. He's peeking in the windows of a store, and the officer thought perhaps he might be casing the store to rob the store because he was wearing a big coat that he might have a concealed weapon. So the officer went up to him. He said, "Hey, come here. What are you doing? What's going on?" He put him up against the wall. He frisked him. He found a gun, an illegal gun. Of course, the gentleman Terry said that the officer's behavior was a violation of his constitutional rights, his Fourth Amendment rights against unreasonable searches and seizures. The Supreme Court ruled that the officer's behavior, based on the officer's training and experience, was reasonable because he had a particularized suspicion that Terry's behavior was suspicious by looking in the window, and also because of the type of crime that the officer thought he might have been encountering, which would have been a robbery, that Terry might have been armed. So stopping him, which is a seizure of his person, was justified to question him briefly, and then the frisk that he performed for weapons was reasonable based on the officer's perceived safety risk of a person he was dealing with who might have a weapon. So that's what a stop and frisk is. It's where an officer has a particularized suspicion that a person is involved in criminal activity, and that officer may go and stop them. That's just the stop part. In addition to the stop part, if the officer also has a reasonable, articulable suspicion that the person may have a weapon, they may then conduct a frisk, which is just a pat down for weapons, not a full search.
The way you explain that makes more sense than the experiences that we've seen. And I'll give you New York City, for example. It's pretty much people walking to work, walking home, kids, adults, and cops stopping them and saying, "Hey, come here," and patting them down. And if they find a gun, then, of course, they're going to be booked. But it was never, in my mind, based on something suspicious was going on.
Particularized suspicion.
The suspicion was simply, it's a minority. They tend to have guns. So let's stop as many of them as we can to get as many guns off the street. But the problem with that is then you're constantly, there's a lot of people who started to feel harassed. Like, every other day, some other guy is stopping me talking about, "Hey, come here," interrupting my day. And, that reasoning that you just gave was never, ever explained to the community as to why that happens. And
well, for one, I gave you the legal definition, that is the Supreme Court's definition of what is a police officer is authorized to do. All of the 50 states have their own constitution,
okay,
in addition to the U.S. Constitution, which may further limit the behavior of police officers, but it cannot grant police officers more authority.
okay,
So I'm giving you the most that officers are allowed to do under the United States Constitution.
okay.
Now, so certain jurisdictions may, like I said, further limit the police to what they can do and how they can do it, but that's the most that they can legally do under the U.S. Constitution. So what we also have to define is when an officer tells you, "Come here," or "Can I speak to you?" There's a difference between a citizen contact and a citizen stop. A stop is where a citizen does not feel like they're free to leave. Okay? A citizen contact is where an officer walks up to a person and just simply engages in a conversation, where a reasonable person would feel like they're free to leave. And so the distinction between a contact and a stop can often be blurred, and officers can deliberately blur this distinction. So for example, if an officer was to just say, "Hey, come here," go up to a person and pat it down, the officer may end up later on saying, "Oh no, that wasn't a stop, that was just a contact. I didn't have any particularized suspicion, but I just went and talked to him, and then he started acting fidgety, acting like he had a weapon, so I patted him down and then I found the weapon." This would not be legally justified. This would be a constitutional violation if the officer knew that what he was doing was putting a person in a position where they felt like they were not free to leave, but then calling it a contact after the fact. And so the distinction could be as simple as this. If I say, hey man, let me speak to you for a minute. Your average citizen may not feel like they're free to leave. If I'm an officer in uniform and I approach them in an authoritative manner. Whereas if I approach them, I'm still in uniform and I say, excuse me, sir, may I speak to you for a minute? The first incident, the person may not feel free to leave. That would be legally a stop. The second instance where I said it more nicely, the person may feel free to leave. I'm actually asking their permission. And so a court looking at this after the fact may determine, okay, yeah, the first part was not justified, but the second part was. And it all comes down to semantics of how the officer approached the person, what they said, and whether or not that citizen felt like they were free to leave. One of the things that a citizen can do to determine whether or not they've been stopped or contacted is simply ask the question, excuse me, officer, am I free to leave?
All right.
If the officer does not say yes, then you have been stopped.
Okay.
And what that does is that gives you certain legal rights that the officer now has to justify why they did what they did.
Right. So it's permissible to say, am I free to leave, or am I being detained? Those are some of the things. And if they say no, then that's just a whole other bag that's been opened.
Right. If an officer approaches a person and says, excuse me, may I speak to you for a minute? And the person says, sure, I'll talk to you. What's going on, officer? That person is making a conscious decision to cooperate and speak to the police officer.
Right.
They've been contacted, and if they're in their mind, they should reasonably feel like they're free to leave. However, if the officer says, hey man, may I speak to you for a minute? And this person feels like a little bit compelled to cooperate with the officer, just for clarity's sake, they may say, officer, am I free to leave? And if the officer doesn't say yes, then what that has done is it has, as long as everybody tells the truth from there on out in the encounter, if it goes to court, a judge would say, hey, this person asked a specific question, are they free to leave? If the officer does not have a particularized suspicion, anything that happens beyond that will be a constitutional violation, and any evidence that would flow from that might not be admissible in court.
You see things on TV, and he shot the gun out of his hand, and he shot him in his pinky toe, and
right.
and that's how you want to fight.
Well, as we were talking about before, firearms are behavior modification devices. Ultimately, police officers are not shoot to kill. They're not trained to shoot to kill. They're not trained to shoot to wound. They're trained to shoot to stop the threat, whatever that threat may be. And the threat, in the event of a use of deadly force like a firearm, should be some type of threat which could reasonably cause serious bodily injury or death by whoever the police officers are encountering. And so the way that you are trained to try to stop that threat is to shoot at the center of mass, because that gives you the most likelihood of actually hitting your target. The reality is that most police officers are not expert marksmen.
Right.
And so in the event that they shoot, they may end up shooting the leg, they may end up shooting the arm, and that first shot may not stop the person from doing whatever they were doing which caused them to be shot. And that includes, trying to fire a weapon at the police officer, trying to stab a police officer, or whatever it may be. You cannot risk trying to aim for extremities which may not cause a person to stop them doing what they were doing. It's obviously an emergency situation, and you need to stop the threat as soon as possible.
In regards to that, we see a lot of news reports recently about unarmed people getting killed. He didn't have a gun. Clearly, the police officer has a gun. So, in our minds, the police officer already has the upper hand. So, why do you need to shoot the person?
Okay. The officer only has the upper hand if he uses the gun.
Okay.
Think about that.
Okay.
Absent the gun, now I'll modify that briefly. it depends on the police department. It depends on what less than lethal options the officers have. Many police officers are given tasers. Many police officers are given pepper spray. Many police officers are given collapsible batons, in addition to a firearm. Pepper spray doesn't work on everybody. Collapsible batons don't work on everybody. Tasers don't work on everybody. Many police officers have no skill with their personal weapons, meaning their fists,
Right.
and being able to defend themselves. If an officer is in a situation where they don't feel like their personal weapons are going to be effective, their pepper spray is going to be effective, their collapsible baton is going to be effective, perhaps they've tried a taser and it's not been effective, and they end up losing that fight, now there is a gun in that fight, and it's just not theirs anymore. It now belongs to the other person, should that person choose to take it. And, you know, a fight between a police officer and a quote-unquote suspect is not like a fight that we have in high school on the playground where 20 people are around watching it. They're not going to let it escalate to the point where somebody gets seriously injured or killed. A fight between a police officer and a suspect is a situation where a person is knowingly committing a felony against a police officer who will be able to identify them in the future should that officer live. And so now they understand in that person's mind, if I want to get away with this crime, I need this officer not to be able to be a witness against me.
All right.
And that's what goes on in an officer's mind, is that this person is fighting me. They perhaps just want to get away, but perhaps they don't want me to be able to be a witness against them. And what does that mean? That means I'm no longer around. And so an officer who feels like that's the case may end up using deadly force if they feel like they've been threatened with serious bodily injury or death.
I have this is probably the last question I'll ask you. This is from Maria Scott. She's from the DMV area. She says, do you believe your training is adequate in dealing with inner city youth versus suburban youth? Do you change your register when dealing with people of different races, social class, education levels? Why or why not?
I think absolutely the training is adequate. I think the reality is that sometimes it depends. I wouldn't say that it has to do with one type of youth versus another youth. It's specific to the encounter. You could deal with a suburban youth who, is nasty, has a smart mouth, and is being uncooperative and hostile and violent. You could also deal with the inner city youth who's acting the same way, and you could also deal with the suburban youth who's compliant, as well as the inner city youth who's compliant. I think it all depends on what that person presents to you. What I have found is that depending on the person, depending on how they were raised, you may say, sir, let's say I have a crime scene. You say, sir, can you step back? I have a crime scene here. I appreciate it if you step back. Some people may comply, some people don't comply at that, polite asking.
Right.
But then when you, quote unquote, speak in their language, I need you to back the F up.
Right.
They might say to themselves, oh, he's actually serious. He actually means don't come into my crime scene.
Right.
And then they realize that they need to comply. It's unfortunate that that's the case, that certain people don't hear politeness, and that you have to sometimes speak to people on the level that they're used to speaking. And it doesn't necessarily mean a person from the inner city or a person from a suburb. It just depends on the person.
All right. The reason why I did this episode was because of the recent events in this country with Mike Brown, Eric Garner, Crawford in Ohio, Gurley here in Brooklyn. There's been a big miscommunication between the police departments in the community. There has been some abuse of power, and I wanted you guys to get an inside look on what the police officers are dealing with. I have a high respect for police officers. I know a lot of people who work in law enforcement. because I was in the Marine Corps, and a lot of Marines get out and join the local or government law enforcement offices. Police officers are civilians before anything. They're just like you and me, but they chose to take a job to protect and serve the community. Along with choosing that job, they understand that they put themselves in the direct line of fire with criminals. When police officers are killed, it's not a good feeling for me. It doesn't make me happy. And I actually think about the safety of my friends who work in law enforcement. People ask, well, why don't you protest that? Because I can't protest for criminals, because criminals don't represent me. Criminals hurt the community and police officers alike. I protest for the community simply because they represent me. And when their rights, which are my rights, are being violated maliciously, that's a problem. And that's the reason why we protest. We don't protest because we want police officers hurt. We don't protest because we want police officers killed. And people who say that are idiots to me. They are spewing hateful rhetoric that to stir up hatred, and that's not what we want. We want fair treatment across the board, and we want safety for everyone. The whole idea of, the shoot first, act later has to stop, because you saw a wallet that was a gun, because you saw a cell phone that was a gun. I hear police officers say all the time, we want to go home to our family, to our wife and kids. Well, hey, we want to go home to our wife and kids too. I think that's fair, but you can't err on the side of caution and it's a total mistake when it's someone's life. And that's what's happening. Diallo had a wallet and was killed. Ramali Graham was followed in his house and killed, and he had no weapon. Akai Gurley decided to take the steps in the building and was killed. And the police department has to hold these rogue officers accountable. And the police officers that have no real world experience, have no real street life skills, shouldn't be given a gun and even become police officers, because whenever things go down, they're the ones that's going to be the first to shoot, because they have no hand skills and they don't really know what to do other than pull the trigger. And what happens there is people die unnecessarily. And the police department has to hold these people accountable. And in the same instance, the community has to start holding itself accountable. There was a point when the village did raise the child. We need to grab these young people and steer them in the right direction. We need to live our lives as an example for them to follow, to know that they can achieve whatever it is they desire. We need to do better. But under no circumstances is the things that happen in our community, the crime that happens in our community, an excuse for innocent people to be killed by the police department. And that's my point of view. Thanks for watching. See you next time.